Hey everybody, welcome to another Retzone podcast. It's been a while for obvious reasons. I have Chris and Ramon here with me today.
Yep, it's Ramon again here.
And it's Chris. And today we're going to be talking about, we're going to start off with physical versus digital media. So we're talking a little bit about preservation. So I guess obviously, pros and cons with the different things. I think realistically, I think physical and digital both kind of have their own place.
I think the three of us consider ourselves collectors, so I think we're kind of on the physical side. Personally, I am.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's almost two different markets. Like, I always will prefer, I think, physical media over digital, just because it's the having it in your hand, and it's kind of a whole different experience with that. But I think the other thing is digital. Sometimes I think there's a place for both of them. Like having digital media, usually you're getting things a lot cheaper because you can buy a game on sale, like, oh, it's like 80% off, it's on sale, so you're always kind of being able to find that deal. The issue I sometimes find, like, more so with the new games being physical, is everything needs like day one patches now.
Oh, that's true.
So it's like you could buy a game anyway. Like, I think we mentioned before, you buy Cyberpunk 2077, and then you're like 5 years later, I'm gonna play it, and the servers are all gone.
Yes, there's that.
And then you're just playing a buggy mess that's not fun.
And then there's the other side of the coin where there's Earth Defense Force 5, which in North America is only a digital release, so I went through the pain of getting the Hong Kong version, which has English in it, and paying a lot more so I could actually have a physical copy.
Play Asia.
Because when the PS...
Yep.
Sorry, did I say PS5 or did I say EDF5? No,
I think you said EDF5.
You said EDF5.
So when the PS4 stores eventually go away, I won't be able to play that game anymore because I'm sure it's got DRM built into it. So,
yeah, I mean, that's the other thing too, is kind of like how much are you just buying paperweights at the end of the day? Because you buy something and how much is really on the disc anymore now? It's just like, well, it's just like a key almost. You put it in, you turn the lock, and then that's it. You have the game. And it's like, well, but it's still all digital. I mean, obviously the argument to be made about like, well, they can never get rid of the stores, but it's like, yeah. I know we were mentioning before we started here talking about the PS3 store and the Vita store. I think they're closing down.
Yeah.
So I mean, with that was bananas. Like,
yeah, they got huge flack for that, so they had to back.
They did a 180 on that one, that's for sure.
I think they were saying like, well, because originally it was they're going to shut it down completely. Then they were saying if you still bought games, you could still play them. But I can't remember if it was like can you still buy games on there now? Like, if you didn't own a game, can you go on the PlayStation Store now and buy a PlayStation 3 game?
Originally, the shutdown was you could download the games that you already owned, but you couldn't buy new games. And that's what everybody was pissed off about. Because apparently people are buying digital PS Vita games still.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, again, when we were saying, like, the market of stuff, like, when you're spending, like, well, I could buy a game used for, $80, or I could buy a digital one for $10. Well, I mean...
You know where people are going to go, for sure.
Well, I think it depends.
Depends,
though. People, if they just want to play the game, they're going to probably get the cheapest available way to play it. So they're just going to buy it digitally and be like, oh, whatever, I own the game, and then that's it.
Right, and some people aren't going to care if they can't play it in 5 years.
Yeah.
Now, personally, I love EDF, and I want to play them for the next 30 years, so I got the physical one so I could do that.
Yeah. Well, I think the digital versus physical only... Like, I'd say it only really goes back a generation or so, because now with, limited run games, they still remake old ones, kind of. Like, they just did a Zombies Ate My Neighbors. They actually made NES carts for it.
I think that's...
Or Super Nintendo carts.
I think that's a special case.
Yeah, I mean, it's the exception, not the rule. Like, you can't buy it digitally for your Super Nintendo, but you can buy the physical copy that's kind of like a reproduction of it.
Yeah.
Cheaper.
Now, an interesting case is Quantum Break. Have you guys played Quantum Break at all?
A little bit.
I've tried it for maybe 5 minutes. I have to go back in the game, but that game size, the install size is so huge.
Yeah, so just in case anybody doesn't know, you play the game, and then depending on how you play the game and the decisions you make in the game, you get these cutscenes which is
It's like an interactive TV show.
It's like an interactive TV show, right? So when you install a game, it says, do you want to install 120 gigs or do you want to install like 40 or 30 gigs? Now the difference is that if you go for the 120 gigs, you're downloading all the possible videos that you can watch in between the levels. But if you don't do that, in between the levels, it actually streams the videos from Remedy servers. So eventually down the road, those servers aren't going to be around. So I don't know if those videos are actually on the disc or...
I would assume not. Like
I assume not.
Like I know it seems like games nowadays. Some games are not like that though, where they have like a play disc and they'll have a game disc. So like one disc will be like your install, and then your other one's just like your key. So they put all the data on one disc, and then your second one's your key.
I'm looking at you, Diablo, with the play disc and install discs.
Yeah, like 4 discs. But I mean, games like Last of Us 2, that one has a play disc and it's got a game disc. But I mean, even that, you're still not getting any game that needs a day one patch is like, well, in the future, are those patches going to be available for you to use?
Yeah.
And I mean, arguably, you can look at like Game of the Year editions, where it's like, well, they pre-patched it on the disc, so you're already getting the patched version of the game. So there's things like that
it's really
make
annoying.
it a bit better. Like, I mean, you think about like old collecting is they didn't have patches. The game when it came out, that was it.
That was
the game. They're not patching it. Now, arguably, I mean, they did make revisions of the games, but it would be like later on there'd be a small change to the game. It's not like you can download code to update your game and fix it.
Yeah,
it was just like, well, whatever glitches are there, and that's that.
And there really wasn't any recalls of games. I mean, they usually got it right the first time.
Yeah, well, I think it had a bit better QA. You had to get it out. It had to be right the first time because that was it. That was the game is out. That's it.
Yeah.
It's like recalling that is an expensive thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really something that they wanted to do. So, I mean, that's my biggest problem, I think, with arguing like, well, physical because you can always play the game is because, well, yeah, maybe you can kind of play it. Like, it's
got
there.
DRM attached to it.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, I know with even like the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox, the Series X, there's issues with you could install a game, but then if you're disconnected, you couldn't play the game. On Xbox, you couldn't, but on PlayStation, you could. Now, I mean, that's things obviously they could patch out where they just like, well, they put a patch to your system that allows you to do it.
Right.
But it's still one of those things you still need to be connected at least once to get it.
It's like that PS4 battery fiasco where if your battery dies in your PS4,
then you're kind of screwed.
You have to connect to the internet once to, I guess, download the new tokens or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you don't do that, you can't play any of your games.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's not really forward thinking where they're just like, well, who cares in 30 years from now, right? And it's kind of that strange mentality about it.
Also, I mean, there's a small percentage of the population that doesn't have access to the internet too, right? So
they do exist.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there is still people who don't have access to the internet and are not listening to our
podcast
right now.
They can use Skylink.
Yeah.
Or Starlink or whatever.
Oh, is it Starlink?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, sorry, I just watched a Transformers movie, so I was thinking Skylink.
Skylink.
It could Starlink. Sorry, Starlink.
You're thinking,
hey, it could be Skynet. Then we're all screwed.
You should have called it Skynet.
Yeah.
They probably couldn't.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess arguably things like with digital run limited run games, I kind of wonder, like, do they come pre-patched? Like, I know a lot of people buy the games, they don't even open them, but it's like, well, let's say you buy like Shantae Half Genie Hero for the Switch,
something like that,
and it's like, well, are you getting the launch version of it, or are you getting like a new version that's all the patches up to that point then released on it?
That's a very good question.
So, I mean, the argument could almost be made for, like, well, when they're shutting down stores, is there going to be this sudden surge of being, like, trying to pump out all these games onto physical media to be like, this is it. This is your chance to get it. Or is somebody actually taking the time to then back up all these things and try to preserve it in the future? Like, here's the last revision of this game. There'll never be any patches to it anyway, so here's the final version. And then they store it somewhere, but I mean, who's going to do that? I know there's like Frank Cifaldi in the Video Game Preservation Society, who does a lot of that, dude. But they do mostly older games, I think, like prototypes and stuff like that.
The betas, unreleased stuff.
Betas.
Magic Castle does that too.
Yeah,
there's another group.
Yeah, there's another group that does it, and I mean that's all fine and good, but
Dark Water.
I guess it's not really something you think about so much with recent games where you think about like, well, what kind of preservation are you really going to be able to have? Because like I said, I mean, if you go to the store day one, you buy a game, how many games now have day one patches? And it's like, well, okay, so if you're talking about preserving it, then having the media that was released at retail is not necessarily the best way of preserving it. It's more having a later copy that would then have all your patches and everything rolled all up into it, and then being like, here's the final release of it.
That would make the most sense to me.
Yeah, but I mean, that seems like a whole endeavor in itself, because it's not something that just anybody can do. You'd literally have to have somebody that would go and get all these games, patch them fully, save all the patches, and then like roll that into a bunch of discs to then save and distribute.
It's like slipstreaming Windows. Oof.
Yeah, well, I mean, because you look at some games like I think like Halo Master Chief Collection, you know, and it's like 80 gigs or something like that, right? And
depends on how many games you install, though. Like, do you want just the Halo Combat Evolved Edition? It's like, it's kind of piecemeal in a way.
Yeah, well, you get so much to it, and it's like, okay, so you're gonna buy like the old floppy disks where you had like, yeah, here's 27 games. It's like, oh, Jesus Christ! Like for one game, you're just having a stack of DVDs to try to play it. Now, I mean, I know Microsoft has never really talked about getting rid of their stores at all. They seem more inclined to be preserving stuff, because for them, I think it's a lot of like, well, it doesn't take up any space, so whatever, yeah, just keep
Except, you know, Xbox, like, original Xbox Live is still down, so, you know, that's forever gone now.
Yeah, that's forever gone. I mean, there's still you know, you can still do System Link and stuff like that with it. People are always going to come up with some way of doing it themselves. But I think it's, like I said, it's tough to preserve games nowadays just because of the fact that you have an incomplete game essentially. Unless you're trying to preserve like the final release of it, and then it's like, well, how do you get that?
Or in some cases, an unplayable game.
Yeah, well, it's a big undertaking, right? Like I said, if you want to really be serious about it, you'd have to be getting, like I said, like final, like they will never patch this game again. Here's the final release version of it, and then having that saved and preserved on some kind of media to be like, well, this is the game. I mean, argument, obviously, do you want to talk about like iterations of games too? Like, because we were talking before about Assassin's Creed Unity, I think, where they actually had capped the FPS at 30 FPS
to fix the game
because it was so broken you couldn't play it.
Digital Foundry made a video where they had the original disc and they played it without patching it, and it ran at 60 frames a second, and then they patched it and it ran at 30 frames a second, but the game was better because it had more resources to run the game rather than trying to do 60 frames a second. So.
Yeah, it was focused on different things.
A good example is Cyberpunk 2077. So anybody who bought that on launch day for a physical version of it for any console will basically be unplayable without the patch, because on some of the systems it was unplayable. On the Series X, it had bugs, but it was playable. But on the PS4, Xbox One, it was garbage.
But I mean, the argument there too is that, well, whose obligation is it to actually maintain that these games are still playable in the future? Like, I mean, regardless of talking about having a physical or digital game, right? Like, whose responsibility is to be like, well, you can always buy this. Because I know with digital games, part of the problem is you start running into issues with licensing. So there's games like Scott Pilgrim versus the World. There was like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Because they had like Turtles in Time. And you run into issues with, you only have license for like 5 years. And that's it. You have the game up for 5 years. Your license runs out where you're not allowed to sell it anymore. And it's like, well, how can you preserve that if you're not allowed to sell the game anymore?
The publisher's not allowed to sell it? Or?
Yeah, like it gets pulled from
there
stores.
Are contracts
you could not go on, like Marvel vs. Capcom 2. It was released for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 digitally, but the Marvel license ran out and you couldn't buy it anymore. I think if you owned it already, you could still go back and download it.
Yeah.
But nobody else knew could buy it. So you weren't allowed to sell the game anymore.
It was the same thing with Scott Pilgrim. I bought it when it came out, and I could still download it anytime I want, but nobody... I don't know if you can now, but for a while you couldn't buy it.
Yeah, but I guess that brings up the question, too, of, like, what obligation is there to actually always have these games available for you to download? Like, at what point can the company say, well, it's gone? Like, are you actually owning the game, or are you just owning the rights to use the game while it's available?
Yeah,
there's almost probably some legal gray area that gets into that.
It's a rights management thing. It's stupid.
You also got like free cases where it's like, say GTA 4 original release, it had all the tracks and whatever, and then the music licensing ran out, and then they had to replace the tracks. So you can still get the game, but the music is now different. So it's got some weird thing going on there. So I'm not sure if you could argue that should be worth preserving or what.
Well, I guess that's the other thing. It's like preserving iterations of game nowadays. It's like, well, if you're talking about preserving these games, it's like, well, do you preserve the original one that had the original bugs and everything like that in it, or do you preserve like a later copy that had like music changed and bug fixes and stuff like that? Because it's like, well, what? Or do you just preserve both? And at what point do you kind of draw the line to be like, well, how much are we trying to save here? Like, obviously they want to try to save everything, but
true.
Like for me, I'd want it preserved the way I played it originally. Like, let's take GTA Vice City for an example. If the licensing for that music ever ran out and they had to change the music, it wouldn't be the same game anymore for me, because the music for me made the game.
But the argument could be made on both sides then. What about somebody who played it later than you?
Yeah,
then should they preserve the other one as well? Because it's like, well, that's how they remember it. It's like, well, doesn't have that music, has this music, right?
There's a word, and I can't remember what it is, where you remember something a certain way.
The Mandela effect?
Yeah, the Mandela effect.
The Mandela
and then you go
effect.
back to it and you're like,
that's not how I remember
this is actually shit.
Yeah.
It's like, this is how I remember this game.
I think it's like Berenstain Bears. Everyone remembers it.
Yeah, the Berenstain thing.
Yeah, they always remember
I call Berenstain Bears.
I know, everyone does, but it's Berenstain.
Yeah, I
it's
know.
It's like
which one is it?
Yeah, it's like, what are you talking about? And you go look and you're like, oh my god, it actually is.
Yeah, it's the Mandela effect. So you want to preserve
effect.
the game in the way that you remember playing it, right? So,
yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, with so many iterations of the game, it's like, what version are you preserving? Like, where are you kind of drawing the line to be like, well, we can't preserve all of it. Like, are you going to have like 70 different copies of like Cyberpunk 2077 for every patch that came out for it?
Yeah, from the launch version all the way to whatever the patch was.
Yeah, like keeping every single patch for every single game that was ever like. It's not that it's impossible. It's just it's a huge undertaking for that.
Yeah, it costs some time, costs some money to do. So,
yeah. Well, yeah, and you know who's paying for it and who's putting in the time and effort to do all that. I think it's important. I think with older games, it's a lot easier to preserve that. Like I'm more so, I guess, in the mentality of preserving like, I guess the history of games. But I guess even that's kind of a weird argument to make of being like, well, what games do you preserve then? Well, anything older than PS2 is not worth preserving. Well, says who?
Right.
Yeah,
it's
like
kinda,
like the
But then you talk about like, what about PC games? What about like Atari games? What about like all these things that had like billions of different versions, right? It's like, well, where do you say like, maybe that's where we got to kind of put a cap on and say that's enough.
Right. Do you preserve all like the shovelware games and you know,
like, I mean,
it is history after all.
Anubis 2 for Wii, like, or,
Gingerbread Man.
Gingerbread Man.
Oh god, I had that game.
I mean, do you think like depends on the person? They're thinking, should I preserve this game because you know when it came out,
or do we just treat it like the hot garbage it is?
So, I mean,
but that's the thing, right? Like, it's kind of that weird argument to make about like I would agree that game preservation is important to be like the history of the games and everything like that. But at the same time, with the way that games are so prevalent now and how many iterations there are and everything like that, it's a lot harder to do.
It gets more
complicated.
complicated.
Quote, right. Yeah, it gets more of a gray area being like, well, what do you preserve? What do you not preserve? Like, at what point do you kind of draw the line and say, we can't really do that? So
one thing I want to bring up is the Xbox Live Arcade version of GoldenEye.
Yes.
That was made, considered a beta, but is completely playable if you play it through an emulator. And the only reason we're able to play it is because somebody found it on a development Xbox that they bought randomly. And for me, that's a beautiful game. I mean, like, cause like, a lot of people like GoldenEye for the N64, right? So when I found out this existed, and it's just like Halo, where you can flip between the N64 graphics and the updated graphics.
Yeah.
Like, stuff like that needs to get preserved because that never came out basically because whoever owned the licensing to it said, nope.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like I said, it's kind of one of those weird arguments to make of being like, what do you... If you're not preserving everything, what do you choose to say? Yes, that's worth keeping. No, that's not worth keeping. Like, at what point do you got to draw the line? I think you almost need to, if you really want to be serious about it, it's like, it's all or nothing.
I like this new trend where if somebody finds something that they think should be kept. They just upload it to archive.org.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, with the way the internet is nowadays, there's so much, storage everywhere that everyone could just, whatever they find, they upload it somewhere, and then everyone has access to it. And that's, like, it's nice.
It's nice when it happens, so it's like, we have something to work with.
I guess I would just kind of end it with saying, like, I would never disagree with preserving anything. It's just a matter of, like, it's nice to preserve, and if people chose to not preserve something for whatever reason, that's kind of their choice to do it or not.
I think when it comes to preserving stuff, it's, personal preference, right?
Yeah.
Like, how far do you want to go, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I know with some of the older games, there's, like, monetary argument to be made because people will be like, oh, it's undumped. This game has never been released, and they want to have like the only copy of it that exists. And it's kind of like,
Yeah, you kind of get to that line where it's like you just hold this one copy in the world, and that's a thing.
Yeah, back in the day, we called those hoarders.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm the thought of being like things that are no longer stored on like a server somewhere that's like be available for the masses if they wanted it. It's like, that seems like stuff that should be preserved. I mean, obviously, the argument of preserving newer stuff is going to come more when they start talking about actually shutting down these servers and services and axing it completely.
Yeah.
So, I think with that, we'll kind of wrap up that little talk.
Yeah, that was good.
It was pretty good. It's like really condensed, like what we thought about game preservation in a nutshell.
We're trying to keep it short. We're going to keep a little shorter ones.
Yep, that's going to be like the format we're trying to go for here. So, yeah.
All right, that's it for our game preservation podcast. Thanks for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more great content.
All right, so I guess we'll see you in the next one, hopefully pretty soon.
I'm out.